All right, thank you very much for making time to come out to our rescheduled June webinar. We're looking forward to hearing from Dr. Jeff Hill about animal risk assessments. He works with UF IFAS Tropical Aquaculture Laboratory and specializes in tropical ornamental aquaculture and non-native aquatic species. So this is our monthly webinar from FISC-PAC, and we'll go ahead and hand controls over to him.
Thanks, Deb.
And if you have any questions during the presentation, please go ahead and put those in the chat. And if you can, keep yourselves muted in the meantime.
All right. Well, good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, I guess now. The topic for today is going to be risk analysis for potentially invasive aquatic organisms. This is one of our main programs that we do in our invasive species group at the Tropical Aquaculture Laboratory. So I'm going to focus a little on Florida, but some of these things are going to obviously be something that you would do wherever you might do any sort of a risk analysis. In fact, obviously, folks on this phone call are going to be familiar with the invasive species problem in Florida. So I'm not really going to go through this very much, except to say we have non-native pathways, we have social and economically valuable non-native, some of which establish, spread, and become invasive, and there are impacts. So we need to distinguish these lower risk species from higher risk species in terms of trade and regulation. So this is a science-based, risk-based framework that we use, supports decision-making, improves management overall. At least that's the goal. So let's talk a little bit about these stages. This may be less familiar to some folks out there, but we'll go through them. Hazard identification. Hazard is anything that can do harm. And so we're familiar with that in our own lives. We're familiar with that with invasive species. It is the initial phase of risk assessment. You want to know whether something is likely to be a hazard or not. And if possible, to then be able to go further. So non-natives are often assumed to be hazards. What is risk? We're going to talk about risk a lot in this talk. So risk is the potential for harm to occur. And it's a little different than hazard, and we'll go through that in the next slide. But risk has a function that describes it. It's a probability that an event occurs, and it's also the consequences of that event if it happens. So with non-natives, that's establishment, that's the event, and then impacts would be the consequences. And we can look at these sorts of simple risk matrices, like the one at the bottom, where impact goes up, farther up the scale you go, and then likelihood goes from left to right. And, we don't want to spend all of our time down in the low side. That's not really where our resources should be spent. Generally, you're going to spend those more in the higher impact areas, those red boxes. But don't forget the yellow boxes. Sometimes those have important implications as well. So what's a hazard versus a risk? So a lot of people get these confused and use them interchangeably. They are different. Hazard is something that has the potential to harm you. So you got the shark swimming in the water and you're standing on the beach and everything's okay. There's a hazard out there, but you're not realizing that hazard. And then you decide to go swimming and it's feeding and it may take a bite out of you. That's the risk. Risk is the likelihood of a hazard causing harm. So here's another diagram that I find useful for talking about risk analysis. Risk analysis is the sum of risk assessment, risk management, and risk communication. And if you look at the diagram on the left, risk assessment is a science-based process. Risk management is a policy-based process. It's informed by science, but it's also informed by policy. And then if you look at the bottom, that's risk communication. That's all around the entire process. These are three distinct steps, but they do interact with one another. And if we don't pay as much attention to one of these three, we do that at our peril. Risk assessment is really defining those risks, finding out those probabilities, what are the impacts, and how severe are they. Risk management's really dealing with how do you deal with that risk in terms of a sustainable and reasonable manner. And then risk communication really improves all these components, especially risk assessment, and it is essential when you've got a risk management plan. Otherwise, if you don't communicate risk properly, people won't do things about it. And the last thing I'll say about risk management for the moment is there are three basic elements. Generally, there's a fourth which doesn't pertain at all, but risk transfer is like you have insurance. So that's shifting risk to another entity. We don't normally do that with non-natives, but risk avoidance and mitigation are common. Risk avoidance is often the most common way that agencies approach it. They want to eliminate the hazard and hence the risk of it. So they'll prohibit something. Now, prohibition doesn't really take it to zero. Prohibited things get introduced in lots of jurisdictions, but the idea is you're reducing that hazard and then hence the risk. Risk mitigation is one that is applied by some agencies as well. They're reducing the impacts. Sometimes there are things you can't avoid, but you can use risk reduction strategies to address those, such as aquaculture BMPs here in Florida. All right, so there's a lot of tools. There's a lot of ways of doing this. How do we do it? Again, there's a lot of tools. These are a few things that we tend to use here in Florida, but we use a variety of others. So we often do what's called a species bioprofile. That is a directed literature review that has elements that you want to gain in terms of knowledge about the species, the location, the risks, etc. So you're going to gather that information typically, and as a literature review, you're going to do something that may inform us about the suitable area. So in the risk assessment area, is there suitable habitat, suitable climate? We often use a CliMatch, which is a climate matching program, and I'll mention that again. So this bioprofile contains a lot of factual information. It also contains expert opinion. So we know maybe how many eggs does it have? How large does it get? What habitat would it live in? Those are the factual elements. You're going to get a lot of that. But also there's some expert opinion in these bioprofiles. Where is it likely to occur in Florida for it to get established? What species might it impact? What sort of economic impacts might it have if it does get introduced? What are similar species? What imperiled species might it impact? Those are things you want to get a good idea of where that might go. So these will contain often sections like that. They're information dense products. There's a lot more information than you need to do the risk screens, which is sort of this next step. But this gives agencies the ability to dig deeper, gives the agencies abilities to begin forming more comprehensive assessments if needed, and also a lot of information on how to manage that species if necessary. And it supports those comprehensive assessments, down the line. So it's good for a lot of products. Here's an example of a bioprofile. This is one of the lionfish species in trade. And it's got a lot of information. Those are the major sections on the left. We've just had a little change. We often do these with FWC, and FWC has a format that's kind of been going for many years, but they've recently changed it a little bit. And so I don't have a couple of the changes there, but they're fairly minor. CliMatch is the program we often use. And if you're interested in it, this is how you can get to it. Very easy, open, free to use online. Australian Department of Agriculture produced it to use in risk assessments and to use in other purposes. It's based on climate stations. So if you have a specimen, it's near a climate station, they'll use that data from the climate station. 8 variables of temperature, 8 precipitation. That's the general acknowledged best way to do it, but sometimes we'll change a little bit. We often will drop off precipitation variables for terrestrial organisms. We don't do that very much for the aquatics. So this compares stations, climate stations in a source location, probably the native range of that organism, and then stations in the target. And that might be Florida or the US or whatever your risk assessment area is. It is a similarity algorithm, and that's important because it is trying to figure out how similar these climate stations are to one another. So there's places in the world that have very similar climates to Florida. There are places in the world that obviously don't. And so we're trying to figure that out to see, is it likely to have suitable climate? Their scores, they range from 0 to 10, no match to perfect match for each individual climate station. And then you do a little bit of math. What's the proportion that are 6 or above out of the whole group of climate stations in your risk assessment area? And that's a climate 6 score. I'll show you that just in a second. And 6 or more is considered to be suitable match. So this is an example of a source map and a target map. This is from the original CliMatch. The source map in Venezuela has these red dots that show those are the dots, those locations are contributing most to match. And then you have the target in the risk assessment area. That's Florida. As you get more to the orange and reds, that means higher match. So in Southeast Florida, the Keys, a few places like that, it has climate match for this catfish here from Venezuela. And the target can be, again, anything from a state to a region, basin, up to a continent. It works a lot better for risk assessment if you're in relatively smaller areas, but climate match works across the big ones. So it matches to the Keys. Well, that fish wouldn't really live in the Keys because of its life history and such. It can't reproduce there in these large rivers, but it still has a climate match. So if you threw one in a backyard pond or something, then that fish would actually live probably just fine. A couple that are on the injurious wildlife list, I'll show you this. This was a project we did for the southeastern US from Texas over to North Carolina. And this species, the Amur sleeper, is on the injurious list. It is a food fish that's often traded as a live food fish in different parts of the world. And it is, we're interested in the climate match of that species. Well, if you look across here, there's nothing on the left-hand bottom side there. See if you can see my cursor. But here from 6 down, there's no climate stations that match that. So that has a 0 climate match. So it's just not suitable all across. A little bit up toward Amarillo in that area, Texas, but even there, it's not quite making it. This is a species from cold climates. Stone Morocco is an exception or a difference here. Stone Morocco has a high match. It's found across lots of cold, temperate, and warm regions of the world. So widely introduced, and it matches to the southeast. About 31% of these climate stations match. And if you look down again at the bottom left, you'll see 495 are in the 6 range, 54 is in the 7, and there's one 8 in there somewhere. In fact, 8 is right there. Here in Florida, between Tampa and Fort Myers area. So that's a species you expect to match well to the southeast, although there are places it wouldn't match. In particular, lower Mississippi Basin doesn't match very well. Piedmont here doesn't match very well. South Texas is sort of a mix. So we get an idea of where these might be able to live. This isn't perfect. This is not a species distribution model. Those can be done, but typically they're done later when you have more interest in that particular species. All right, so those are some of the aspects of it. Here's a sort of the tools, you might say, that we use. If you're familiar with the IFAS weed risk assessment, that is something that is based on the Australian weed risk assessment and is a tool that is used here in Florida for plants. That was developed as an offshoot of the WRA. All these tools have very similar characteristics in that they're questionnaires and they score. The higher the score, more likely it is to be risky and invasive. The several invasive screening kits were put together by CIFAS, which is an agency in the UK. And the one that really kind of worked the most was the fish invasive screening kit. UF had a part, our group had a part in updating that to version 2. And that's been used quite a bit around the world, but now it's superseded by the aquatic species invasive screening kit, which is ASISC, and I'll show you just briefly what that means. All right, so screening tools. What do you want to use them for, and what are their kind of advantages? Well, they're relatively cheap. You can do things with lower resources than a comprehensive big assessment. They are relatively fast. You are looking for specific data on an organism or a group of organisms to begin to do that assessment. So you have this roadmap to where you need to go. The bioprofiles in general will help fill that. And then you can have a single assessor. 2 to 3 are common. Some people do more, but generally that's experimental. Some studies have shown that 2 is probably the best number. 1 and 3 are very good, though, right, kind of right around it. So what do you get for your money for that, so to speak? Well, when you put that time and effort into it, you get 3 basic outputs. One is it a hazard or not? So you're able to kind of look at that and determine, is that a species that might prove to be a problem? You can generally distinguish high versus low risk species. And so that gives you some insights into, do you need to do more assessment? If it's a low risk species, unless there's something unusual about it, you probably don't need to do a lot of additional assessment. If it is a high risk species, you probably want to do more assessment to determine the full range in severity of risk, and also it really informs a lot of your risk management to do those more comprehensive assessments, a full risk analysis, you might say. If it's medium, you're picking and choosing in some ways. If it's a lower end of medium, again, maybe it's more like a low risk species, because medium and low are non-invasive in this structure. But there are things that can make a medium risk species of interest that you want to go farther. We've just done this for the Nile crocodile. So the Nile crocodile is not your average guppy, if you think about it. It's one of the most dangerous organisms in the world, kills a lot of people in its native range every year. It comes out as a medium risk species. And the reason is yes, it could live in Florida, it certainly could, but from an invasive standpoint, probably wouldn't be that invasive. It's controllable, those sorts of things, but it is really dangerous. So these tools have danger in them, but they don't, it's not like it's 20 points, it's a few points. So a species can be highly dangerous and not show up as invasive in these types of tools, but you always look at how they got there. What were the scores that came? How did they come about? And is there anything about them that's unusual? So this is a species, the Nile crocodile, that you'd want to look into more because it is dangerous. There's a difference between invasive and dangerous. All right, so here's the tool. It's a visual basic overlay on an Excel spreadsheet. You can download it easily from the CISMA website. And it runs just on Excel. Any aquatic species, I've never done plants, and so I don't know how it performs with plants, but I've done a lot of different types of animals, freshwater, brackish, and marine. And overall, it does a very good job of distinguishing high and low risk species and forming hazard identification for those sorts of organisms. So this is a questionnaire, just like the IFAS risk assessment. It has 49 questions that make up the basic assessment, or the BRA. And that can stand alone. That's current conditions. And that's what you would use if you're making decisions based on current conditions. If you're interested in what climate change might do for this, there are 6 additional questions that will give pluses, minuses, or zeros to that score. So you add that to the original BRA to get the BRA plus CCA. I know it's a lot of letters there, but basically the basic assessment plus the climate assessment. These are generally calibrated for a threshold between medium and high risk. It's not completely done for all these different taxa, because this is still a developing tool, even though it's been, thousands of assessments have been done. It takes a little bit of time to build up the particularly the more regional thresholds. So we're working on those. Some things have thresholds already, but that's only for the BRA. So if the climate change is higher, well, it's still going to be the same risk level. Climate change is lower, it might actually drop. If it's higher and goes high enough, we might change our mind about the risk of it. But this is basically the front. This is where you start. You go in. It uses Excel as a database. Won't go into too much detail with that. But so the ASS, you get scores that are based on these different areas. So the questions are within these areas. And then you have, so the BRA is A and B. So it goes 1 through 8. The CCA is 9. And so that's where you're going to get those. I show you again the link. This will be likely moving to USGS website for the future. So that may be coming up soon. That's in the works. So I'll show an example of using this. So this is a lionfish. We're real familiar, probably, or at least you've heard of the 2 lionfish that are out in the tropical Western Atlantic. And so we use those to compare to the other 14, I believe it's 14 species, maybe 11 here. Sometimes you get confused on numbers of species in these different studies, but these are things that are in trade. And so we're interested in knowing about them too. Will they become invasive as well? So if you look at the basic risk assessment questions, this is question 17 of 55. And it's a question. You have question guidance here at the top. You have your response, which are pull down boxes. And they're generally a yes, no, or not applicable, something like that. Some of them do have numbers that you put in. And then you have confidence. That would be certainty or uncertainty. And this is kind of a range of those so that you have an idea of the confidence that the assessor had for this question, and then you can develop an index that gives some idea about the overall assessment confidence. And I'll show you numbers here in just a second. If you've never used these tools before, you don't even have to look at this right here. This section on compatibility was for those of us who have used the old tools. And so this doesn't really mean anything if you're just starting out new. But here's a justification. This tells you why the answer was what it was. It can explain the confidence if you may have an unusual confidence for a question. This is the transparency. You can see response, the confidence, and the justification with references, either directly to the literature or you can reference the accompanying bioprofile if needed, that sort of thing. So you have transparency. And if you don't like an answer, so say we send something in to FWC or to another agency and they look at it and they say, yeah, I don't agree with this answer. They can actually take this, give a different answer, and then see what the score, how it changes. So they can check the assessors and say, hey, I don't like the answer to this one. What would happen if these answers were different? So that gives a lot of transparency and flexibility for agencies too. Here's some outcome. This is in graphical form, but these are numbers that you would get from the tool. These are for these lionfish. The front 2 here these are the invasive species, and this is the score. They score in the 30s, which is high, very high. So it shows, yes, indeed, those are invasive species. I think we all know that. But this is the tool, and it's working as it should. This is a species that's very similar, but has not invaded anywhere in the world. And so invasion history is a big thing. And so its score would probably be up in here if it had invaded elsewhere. Maybe not quite as high as these two, but it would be certainly well into the high risk. Then they begin kind of trailing down. So the black bars are the basic risk assessment. The gray bars include the CCA. And you'll notice that some of these go up and some stay the same. And then some of these actually get lower. So climate change is going to have different effects on these species and depending upon the species. And that is because some of these live in cooler waters naturally. Some of them live in deeper waters. Some of them just don't have very strong tolerance attributes. This Dendrochirus bellus, we always joke about this fish. We don't know how it lives in the native range because you look at it and the fish dies. So it's a really kind of a wimpy fish, but they're around at low numbers, obviously, in their native range in the Pacific. So this is something we'd often get. And then this is a way of looking at it as well. The risk screen can be partitioned into scores for different species. So if you look at the left, you see the scores for the 2 invasive species. And in the right, all the rest of them. So the first thing you'll notice is everything is a plus on this side, and things are pluses or zeros or minuses on this side in terms of the basic assessment. And you see like these 2, invasive elsewhere and undesirable traits, are very high with the invaders. Here it's 0 and not so high in terms of the other species that are in trade. And that varies. You see some error there. And then the next thing you might see is tolerance attributes. These fish are quite tolerant, the ones we have now. The fish that we don't have are not very tolerant comparatively. So those are 2 areas that really show the difference between those species. We have high confidence for the invasive complex. This index goes up to 1. So this is a 0.72. We have, and also it's a pretty small error bar there. Reduced confidence for the others. This is only a 0.59. And the reason is there's much less information available for these non-invasive so far species versus the invasive species. All right, so we can also do species profiling. This is a little more complicated in that you have to choose a region, you have to develop a list of potential variables to explain success or failure of these species as invaders. It takes a lot more money and time. You got to get quite a bit of data together and run models. But this was done. Katie Lawson was a PhD student of mine, and she and I worked on this and published some papers on this idea of life history traits and what we call a triangular model. And I'll tell you what that means. But we used 31 successful, 32 failed, and 60 native species. The native species were just for comparison, but we're trying to distinguish between successful and failed non-native freshwater fish in Peninsular Florida. So parental care was the big difference. 97% of the successful species had parental care, whereas failed species were a mix of species with and without parental care. Obviously, natives are a mix too. So the equilibrium strategy, and I'll show you what that is in a moment, the next slide, is related to basically a middling size at maturation. So they're not small, they're not big, they're sort of in the middle. Mean fecundity is relatively low, but investment per progeny is high. So these are species that have parental care and put a lot of investment each individual. So they have high survivorship. So you'll see some examples here in a second. Success was related to larger body size. That was a dispersal one. Salinity tolerance also was dispersal. But these 2, larger egg size, higher parental care, were pretty much for all the different stages of invasion, from reproduction to spread, and then no fluvial dependency. So species that require sort of riverine conditions, spawning conditions, have not been successful in Peninsular Florida. We do have a couple of native species that just get into the peninsula, but many fluvial species have been released, and there's so far been no success for them. These are the life history, and I won't go deep into this, but there's 3 endpoints. There's a lot of species in between, and periodic and opportunistic species tend not to be successful in Florida, whereas the equilibrium species are the ones that are successful, though many equilibrium species have not been successful. So it's not a guarantee of success, but you can pretty much chop off the periodic and opportunistic in terms of the historic ability to establish. Cichlids are great for this. They are parental care, highly developed parental care. They have a lot of investment per progeny. They're kind of middle-sized, although some are still small. But that's just the group and some catfishes that tend to be most successful in Florida. All right, so how are these things used? Kind of take those tools and then where do you go with them? So one of the questions I get asked all the time is, what can you do? You know, and and I kind of smile and say, whatever you like. It just depends on what you're interested in. But I ask the question, what information do you need to make your management decisions? If you're feeling that, then that's as far as you go or need to go in general. If you're not feeling that, then you need to go farther. So that's the general question there. And risk assessment, like many things, is a S-curve in terms of the resource inputs versus the outputs and payoffs. So if you look early on, it takes a bit of resources to get going. Then you get to a spot where little bits of additional resources can really crank up the information return, but then it flattens again and you end up with this sort of diminishing returns. You can spend forever doing these things. I mean, we've actually done some that are easily 18 months with all the pieces and parts that went into them. So options, there's a lot of options. I won't go all over all of these because of time, but generally in Florida, most agencies would like a biological synopsis and risk screens done. And so that's what we do. We work with them afterwards to sort of recommend, do we need to go farther, that sort of thing, and what sort of products we might need if we did go forward. We're developing a secondary screen right now. We're using some of that life history data work, and it's again, what is the industry as well? We do these for the aquarium and the aquaculture industries. So whatever their needs are to make decisions. There's been a lot of species assessed. This is for the U.S. There's been probably multiples of this, definitely multiples in Europe and other countries, but about 335 species by risk assessment. It's probably around 300 species have been done, mostly in either conterminous U.S. or Florida. In the marine side, southeast U.S. coast, Florida coast, and the Gulf of Mexico. That's where most of these have been done. There's a few other studies. We're just publishing a review paper right now that's accepted that has a lot of this information in it. Mostly freshwater fish, then marine inverts, and then marine fish, one brackish fish, and a few others. This has really expanded since we've been doing more. There's a lot of reports, things that are not published. These are all published. So we're trying to pick up that backlog a little bit. Just briefly, this is from one of our review papers. This was Fisk, and this showed all the spots where Fisk had been done. The ASISC has been done a lot more now in the last few years, and is multiples of this. But this kind of to show you that a lot of stuff that we do is part of a larger group of risk assessment scientists globally. And it's really, it's a good interchange of ideas and such. And we work together on some of the lessons learned, et cetera. All right, so final considerations. I'll wrap up here. History, minimum standards, all these different things are types of elements that you should know about as a manager or user of these, or as an assessor, someone doing these particular assessments. This is historic. So we use the history to predict the future in risk analysis. And we do the same thing with if it's an insurance or if it's invasive species. If you were a financial planner, you'd say past performance is not a guarantee of future returns. As a risk assessor, I say past performance is not a guarantee of future returns either. There is uncertainty, I should say, in this process. So this is used as part of the decision process. Only 3 factors really are consistently related to invasion success across the world and across different organisms. They don't all work everywhere themselves. Propagular pressure, how many individuals are getting out there, how many times, climate match that we discussed, and invasion history. Have they invaded elsewhere? And if they have, do they have impacts? And that's one reason that we do regional analyses. These are important because different areas and different taxa sometimes are different in their reasons for success or failure. There are minimum standards that are out there. This is an important paper put together by a European group, and we feel that we really need to incorporate all of these elements to make a good high quality assessment. ASISC was the first tool published that actually fulfilled all of these. So it's an important thing to keep in mind, and we have some additional ones. On the standards, my mentor and dear friend, Gordon Kopp, who passed away recently, said, if you aren't an expert, then find one. And that was very important to have people that are expert in the things that we're doing. Most important standards, I think transparency is the biggest one. Quality assurance peer review, of course, is important. And we need to include uncertainty in our estimates. So risk managers can actually use this information better. And we want to include stakeholders when possible. I have to say we don't include them as much in these early areas, but if we're doing a full assessment, we want that experience and that knowledge base. And we also want the input of affected groups in that. So whether that affected group is an agency that has public lands or an industry that uses non-natives, but everybody should have an input on the information that's out there. And then we have bias and uncertainty. Bias and uncertainty is in every single risk assessment that's ever been done or ever will be done, no matter what the field. But these are the three general areas of bias and uncertainty, which we need to keep in mind always as we're doing these and interpreting them. Data, assessor, and method. Data, there's a lack of data in many cases. There may be inaccurate data. It's good to find the gaps and start filling those gaps. That's one of the things we do as well, is point out these gaps, and we either try to fill them with research or agencies will do so, or others. The assessor is very important. It can be biased, not saying the assessor is a bad person, not saying that the assessor's got nefarious motives. Bias is a human trait. Inexperience is a big one. Training can overcome inexperience. And we have seen that assessors are better trained. You need to know about risk assessment. It's a field unto itself. Invasion ecology, taxonomy, biogeography, physiology, species of all sorts, the regions where they come from and where they might go. This is taking everything you ever learned in invasion ecology and kind of putting it together and trying to use it as a good application to assist decision making. And the method needs to be tested. We need to know the systematic biases. How does it perform? Is it a good tool? Is it fit for purpose? All those sorts of things that can be very important and often are not incorporated when people release different tools. And then really the last thing is risk management. Again, we talked about it earlier. A lot of what we deal with is risk mitigation. We assist with risk mitigation in terms of training, in terms of advice on species and different things. But different agencies use different approaches. There are regulations, there are non-regulatory approaches, obviously education, and then the industry and public compliance is a really big part of it. That is what makes it work. And so risk communication, again, is such an important aspect that sometimes gets overlooked. So I was a whirlwind through aquatic species risk assessment. There's a lot of rabbit holes we could have gone down today, but that's the overview. If you have more questions, I'm happy to answer questions now, but if you have more questions, drop me an email. I'm down at the Tropical Aquaculture Lab down in Ruskin, and lots of folks on the call I recognize. So if you have something that you want to discuss, certainly give me a holler.
That was great. Thank you very much, Jeff.
Well,
We haven't got any questions in the chat yet. Do we have any questions from anyone at the moment? While we're waiting to see if anyone else has some, I would like to know, what's the most interesting species you've done an assessment on so far?
Gosh, there's several, but probably the most interesting is the new Sicilian that is introduced down in the Miami area. That is a South American species. It's the first introduction of that order, probably anywhere in the world. And it's even the amphibian experts are like, that's a weird critter. So one of my graduate students gave a talk on the risk assessment that we did in the Florida chapter AFS. And if any of you are familiar with that, that's we have an unusual award called the Power Tie. And it means a lot of different things to different people, but one of them is one of those talks that really stands out and you've never heard anything like it. She won the Power Tie for for that talk. It's just a really oddball organism. It looks like a big earthworm with teeth and little tiny beady eyes, and everyone's trying to figure out what that thing is and what it does.
That does sound pretty interesting. So we had someone ask if we can get a link to the tool.
Yes. So
And
on the
go
uh,
ahead.
on the talk here, twice I put the CIFS one up. It should still stay up for a while, and then eventually it'll move to USGS, and there will be a link from CIFS to that USGS site when that happens.
So we have another question as you're, if you can grab that link and get it in the chat. In the meantime, how long does each assessment take and how are candidate species chosen? And thank you, Megan, for getting the link in the chat.
Oh, thanks. So how long do they take? Well, that depends a lot on what's known. So if you have a bioprofile and it's a familiar species, I mean, one of these assessments can take, half a day, something like that, sometimes even quicker if you've done something similar in sort of as a group. If you don't know anything about it, I mean, the Sicilian was a while, and a lot of us had input to it, even though two people did the actual assessment for the product. So they can take days, or they can take less than a day. So that's the good thing about these questionnaires. You can move through them fairly quickly if you have the right information. So they pair very well with those bioprofiles because of that. I think there was another part of that question
How
besides how
candidate
long.
species are chosen?
Chosen, how are they chosen? So we work a lot with agencies that have an interest in a species. They may have a list of species that they're concerned about. And so we might choose species, from that list. There may be something that's come up. So again, the Sicilian popped up new. That was a species that, we certainly worked with the agencies to choose and get that done. Some species are, from a trade perspective, some agencies are interested in what are actually low risk groups that we don't have to spend as much time and effort on. And can we kind of move those off the shelf? So we'll do some of those groups. So a lot of it has to do when we have some that we're interested in, and we may work on separately, but those things are chosen are often just there's an interest in them. And are they invasive? Are they not invasive? And agencies need that information when they're starting to make management decisions.
Thank you. So I scanned through the website real quickly. Is there a place within the website where the tool's at where you can see the outputs from risk assessments? Is there like a good place to find the species that you've looked at for Florida and see what the results are?
So we just again, it's accepted. It's not out yet, but we have a review paper that looked at all of the ones done in the U.S. by us or others, and some of those numbers you saw were from there. That should be coming out soon in the management of biological invasions, which a lot of folks are going to be familiar with that journal. There's a special issue in memory of Gordon Kopp, and that's one of the articles. Over time, we're also trying to deposit risk assessments with USGS, again, as a repository where people can access them. There's always, of course, a bit of a lag. Do we publish this as, those are things that we're kind of working out, but we want to get our information out there and accessible to, agencies and the public if they're interested in the scientific community. And sometimes we can't get everything published as rapidly as we'd like. So, if people can use them, that would be, we would be happy to, have that.
Awesome. Another question, is this approach applicable to terrestrial animals too?
Yes, it actually is. We are working with a new version of ASISC, which is the terrestrial animal species ISC, invasive screening kit. It's very similar in structure. Again, it's a modified weed risk assessment for terrestrial animals, and it works with pretty much all of the taxa, excuse me, that are missed by either ASISC or the various weed risk assessments. There is a weed risk assessment equivalent, the terrestrial plant, but I tend to stay a little bit out of the plant world because that's not my expertise, and so I haven't used that one yet. But Luke Flory was involved in developing that one. Many of you'll know Luke from he's actually works with the assessment and is works with invasive plants. So yeah, it works pretty well. We use that for terrestrial herps. We've used it so far for a bird, one bird. No, we did the ASISC for that. Was aquatic birds. We haven't done birds yet in that, but we have some mammals that we're working on and a few other groups as we kind of test that new tool along with a lot of other folks.
Very cool, thank you. Any other questions from the group? All right, well, thank you very much for your time, Dr. Hill. That was great. And if you do have questions later on, you can always email them at the email address that he gave earlier. So I'll go ahead and, yep, thanks. Start sharing and move on to our FISC pack and CISMA summary. Okay, hopefully you all can see my screen okay. So we've got, even though it's the hot summer months, we have a lot of great opportunities coming up. So several CISMAs are still doing meetings, some in person, some virtual. And huge kudos to the hardcore workers at Manatee Springs State Park and having a work day in this weather. I hope everyone stays cool and you're able to get a good amount done. A couple great workshops that I want to point out. There's Heartland CISMA's got a herbicide fundamentals workshop in the middle of August, and there is a wild hog management workshop towards the end of August down in Ona. Looking at announcements, we've only got one at the moment. FWC has developed this awesome outreach poster about protecting Florida natives. If you're interested in getting copies, you can email their staff at this email address here. Continuing on for our monthly CISMA calls, next Wednesday on our regularly scheduled date, we'll have habitat modeling of non-native avians. We've got several student research presentations in August. We'll learn about invasive plant sampling with the Florida Park Service in September. And then in October, we'll learn about python habitat use study. And if you have topics that you'd like to see for 2025, please send me an email. I'm starting to pull together some lists for potential speakers and topics now. So I'd love to hear what you are interested in. And that wraps up our presentation for today. Thank you all very much for making time to come out. Hope you stay cool this summer and have a great day.